everybody for joining us today. So it is my pleasure this is actually the first RIWI webinar. We're going to be hosting a whole series of webinars over the course of 2023. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Macrostrategist David Wu. David is the former chief macrostrategist for Bank of America and now he founded Unbound, where he examines the political, economic, and technological forces driving the global macro environment. And he makes bold and actionable predictions about those changes. What's interesting, and I think we'll hear a lot about this today, but David really brings sometimes a very counter common wisdom perspective. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives today, David, on a suite of really novel indicators that we've developed together to look at today's, with respect to today's theme, which is about alternative data during a polycrisis era when, if we look at even the last week or last few weeks or even the last few days, we've had a lot of new developments, and we're going to be looking at those through the lens of some daily high frequency data that we're collecting on these range of events. So, we're going to be talking about everything from the war in Ukraine to China's reopening to the US labor market to China, Taiwan, and so on today. So we've got a pretty interesting, I think, set of data and events to talk about. David, do you want to maybe say a couple words about these unique indicators that we're developing together and why you wanted to create them?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. I think, having been, I've worked on Wall Street for over 20 years. And I think, when it comes to proprietary data, I think, I know there's a lot out there in terms of, data that are designed to capture economic activities at one level or another, and I think, I think from that point of view, I really don't think investors can actually do with even more economic data. Whereas I think political data and geopolitical data, I think they're in short supply. And I think there's no doubt that, especially in this current environment where politics and geopolitics actually are taking, in my view, basically front seat in terms of driving the global economy, policies, and markets ultimately, I think there's no doubt that I think it's very important for investors or self-respecting investors, macro investors, to be armed with basically data that can allow them to navigate not only, I think, a very treacherous environment in terms of, the geopolitical dynamic, but most importantly, to navigate, to actually get to the bottom of what's really going on, given the amount of propaganda that's out there coming from every side. So I think from that point of view, I think this is what, I think, we can offer that nobody else can. And I'm very confident. And we've designed basically these data series with the view of trying to basically make them as useful as possible for basically investors, especially for investors, in terms of understanding, where the risk lies and how you can actually make sense of how these things could potentially affect the markets in the world.
Great, thank you. I would also add that, having looked at as somebody who analyzes things from more of a foreign policy lens and geopolitical lens, they're also quite interesting from that lens as well. So first of all, these indicators that you're about to see are going to be not just covering, the various economic activities in real time, but looking at the political and geopolitical. I'll also just mention a couple of other parts of these, or basically other qualities, I guess, of the indicators that we're looking at that I think make them quite interesting. The first one is that we're collecting these data, and this doesn't often happen with political data and opinion data, but we're collecting them on a daily basis, on a continuous basis. So that's really important because you may not believe a particular data point, but what we're looking for is changes in the data. The second thing that's really important is we're collecting them from people closest to the activity or closest to the ground. So when we're asking people about the war in Ukraine, we're collecting it data from people across all parts of the country, in both Ukraine and in Russia. And we're doing that using a methodology where we intercept people when they're online. So we're doing this, we have so many different ways in which we intercept people online to basically minimize the bias from any particular source and try to give you access to the broadest set of opinion rather than opinion from people who are just typical survey takers and will kind of sit there all day and take surveys. We really want to get breadth of opinion. So that's what we're trying to do. We're doing it on a continuous daily basis. And the other thing is that we're doing it anonymously. So we're not collecting people's personally identifiable information, minimizing the chance that they are going to lie to us. But of course, you know, we're trying to minimize those biases. So those are just some qualities of the data that we're going to show you in a few minutes that I wanted to highlight, in addition to the fact that they're going to cover geopolitical, political, and economic. Okay. Anything I missed, David? Or shall we go and look at the data?
No.
Okay, so let's, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to show you some of these data in real time. Okay, so can everybody see this chart? So this is just to introduce what you're looking at, and then David, I'm going to turn to you to ask for your interpretation. So we continuously are asking over the next few weeks, do you think military tensions between between Ukraine and Russia, and then we're asking people, will they become less intense, more intense, and we've got a 5-point scale there. What you're seeing in the lines above are averages of those. We added together those responses, and then we've taken a 7-day moving average. So David, you know, looking at this right now, Ukrainians are really, really concerned about conflict intensification. The Russians are not. What do you make of that? You can see
Yeah,
the
I think,
since
I
January
think for
in particular.
me, I think, having, I mean, as you said, as people can see, we've been collecting this data for now a year. So from that point of view, this data set basically spans the entire period since the beginning of the invasion. So I think, it's very, I mean, so from that point of view, I think it's a long enough sample for me to have quite a bit of confidence, I think, in what the numbers are telling us. What it's telling us right now, first of all, as you can see, the blue color line, which, relates to Ukraine, I think is now at the highest level since the beginning of the invasion. I think that in itself is very telling. Like, the war has been, has been going on for a year, and all of a sudden, basically, in the beginning of 2023, more Ukrainians now believe that, things are going to get intensify than any time since the invasion. I think that, in fact, is very telling. What is even more telling is the fact that, that the number of Russians who think things are going to intensify is actually near the lowest level since the invasion. So what is interesting here, of course, is that there's been a very sharp divergence. What does this divergence tell me? What it tells me, again, having looked at this data very closely for the past year, all I can tell you is that what this divergence tells me is that the momentum on the battlefield is turning very much against Ukraine. Okay. Because, what we have found, and certainly this is what I found, is that when people, whichever side is losing at that moment in time, they tend to expect things to get more intense. And I think we'll talk more about that momentarily, but I think this is consistent with reports that, Bakhmut has been encircled. There are 70,000 basically, Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut, and it's now too late to probably, to retreat, which means that they are now poised being completely destroyed, possibly by the Russians. And this is also consistent with the fact that the Russians have now taken the Soledar. They've now basically literally have probably owned half of Marinka. In other words, the entire Zelensky line, the Russians it looks like they are poised to basically break through. Now, of course, you wouldn't get this, okay, if you were just following mainstream media, which is clearly very pro-Ukraine because they've been fed by very pro-Ukraine propaganda by Washington, by London, and elsewhere. And I think from that point of view, whereas the news, basically cycles continue to focus on the fact that, while these tanks are going to be arriving soon, that's going to arrest the changing momentum in the battlefield. What this chart is telling you very clearly is that perhaps, from the point of view of Ukrainians, these tanks will be arriving perhaps too late. And I think this is actually a very important thing, because there's no doubt this is probably, if you look at this chart, this is probably the first time since the beginning of the invasion that, I think that the momentum has moved decisively in favor of Russia. Again, the whole point here is that we are assuming that the Ukrainian respondents, the Russian respondents to our surveys, are actually, because they're close to the ground, they've got families and friends who are fighting the front line, that somehow that they're closer to the conflict, therefore they can read through the propaganda better than you and I can. And the fact that we're seeing such divergence, to me, again, gets to, I think, what is really happening on the ground, which is consistent with my own analysis and following other resources. So I think from that point of view, this is actually providing just confirmation that things are going very poorly for Zelensky.
Really interesting. That's definitely not very different than what you might read in the New York Times or others. I zoomed in a little bit more so we can see that this is, it's been escalating throughout January for the Ukrainians, and even in the last, this is actually as of this chart just displays data as of the end of yesterday in the Ukraine and Russia, and so you can see it like it's still going up for the Ukrainians. It's just the most notable period in all of our data collection over the past year. Very concerning. So maybe we can go on. We'll go on. Actually, we're not going to show you every single chart in our data set. We've kind of picked out the ones we think are most interesting. But I think the next chart, where we're asking people about opinions about their leadership and how they're managing the conflict, is also maybe adds to the story that you were mentioning. Hold on a sec. I'll pull us up this nice chart here. So this chart shows, we were asking a question, how do you feel about the countries, how do you feel about, in Ukraine, we're asking about, how do you feel about Ukrainian leadership's approach to the conflict with Russia? And we're asking the opposite in Russia, and again, it's a 5-point scale from strongly opposed to strongly in favor. I'm just going to try to pull this up so I can show you the whole chart on one screen. Okay. Yeah, so maybe I don't know if you want to talk about maybe Ukraine first. I'll just highlight that of what's happened in Ukraine, which it was pretty consistent throughout the entire data set of support for Zelensky being higher than support for Putin in our data set. But look what's happened in recent days. I don't know if you want to comment on that, David. How
Sure.
do you interpret this?
I think, to see this, you can see from basically March on, last year up until September last year, it was very stable. If you look at for Ukraine, the blue color line. But, since September, from September until the end of this year, last year, you can see there was basically an improvement, right? And I think this had a lot to do with, basically the counteroffensive, staged by the Ukrainian side that allowed them to recapture Kherson and also the Kharkiv region. Okay, so that's consistent with the idea that Ukraine was basically, making gains in the battleground. They were regaining some of the lost territory, and they were getting more and more help from the US and from Europe. And what is interesting to me, of course, as you can see here, the last few weeks, there's been a sharp drop of Zelensky. I look at this as almost like an approval rating for Zelensky. I mean, this thing has really come off very sharply. I mean, this is despite the fact that the West has now agreed to send another, 300 basically tanks to Ukraine. This is, after the West, like US just last week signed up another $2.5 billion of arms, including long-range rockets, to Ukraine. So I think, the fact that this number suddenly has dropped off, I think that is very consistent with what we saw in the previous basic set of data, which is that Ukrainians are now waking up to the realization that their side is losing, or rather that, that right now the momentum of the war is going against them. Okay. And I think this is actually rather important because, again, if you look at this, especially in contrast to what's happening in Russia, in red here, you can see that, it's come off from the low. By the way, it's very important. You can see even the red line. And what's interesting here is that even though, okay, the red line's below the blue line, meaning that Putin's approval rating is below that of Zelensky's, okay, in Russia, the reality is that it's still above zero, by the way, meaning that more people approve, Putin than those who disapproved him. So I think that in itself is very important, that we never really went below zero. And more recently, there's been an improvement. Okay. So I think, again, the fact that we're seeing this divergence tells me once again that, that Russia, despite, the fact that this war has dragged on for almost a year now, the fact that, the Russian economy hasn't been doing that great, but I think it tells you that Putin still enjoys reasonably strong support, I think, in Russia. By the way, if you want to think about, if you don't believe in these data saying, oh, well, listen, maybe, the Russians are controlling this, the Ukrainians controlling it. I mean, there's propaganda on both sides. The fact that, I think, the Russian side is actually improving, whereas the Ukrainian side is deteriorating. It just tells you, I think there is definitely information there that I would take it to heart. Again, every piece of data we look at, we're looking at in the context of the general picture, whether it affirms or disprove our central scenario. I think there's no doubt that if you're looking at this, there's no doubt that this, again, supports the idea that, Putin now is on it. It's basically like Putin's not going to stop because there's no pressure for him to stop because, in fact, things are going his way. And this is despite the fact that there was, speculation that CIA Director William Burns traveled to, Moscow 3 weeks ago and secretly offered, Russia to basically 20% of Ukraine in exchange for ending the conflict. I think this is telling me that Russia has absolutely no incentive whatsoever to stop right now, especially given they're on a winning streak. This is also telling me that the Ukrainian side is getting more desperate, but I think also it's telling me that, I imagine that even Zelensky does not know for sure, whether indeed the Americans are trying to cut a deal with the Russians behind his back. And I think he's naturally afraid of being sold out by the Americans. This is why I suspect that he's probably not going to give up this fight either, because he thinks if he loses, the fight over Bakhmut, basically eastern Ukraine, that could give the U.S. an excuse to sell him down the toilet. And I think this is why he's actually continued to send reinforcement to the front. This is why we hear that, the Ukrainian side is grabbing 16-year-olds on the streets of Kiev to send them to the front. So I think, this just tells me things are going to get much worse. Okay. And that's important because until now, the market hasn't been paying enough attention to what's happening basically in Ukraine in terms of the war. But I think if it gets much worse, this picture is going to have to change in the market.
David, also, of course, in the last day, Zelensky has traveled to Paris and London as well. That is consistent with your interpretation. Do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think, listen, I mean, I think, again, this report that Burns, made a secret offer to Putin, came from the most respected newspapers, in Switzerland. I mean, I can tell you that it's the first basically newspaper that most German chancellors basically read when they wake up in the morning. So this is not like I think from that point of view, it's not impossible. So this is why I can understand and why, all of a sudden, Zelensky's going to Europe and trying to basically rally the European allies. I think there's no doubt in my mind, if you couple this with, what we know, I think there's no doubt that the most decisive war in this entire, basically, story over the past year is being fought right now. And this is why, Bakhmut, we could argue whether it has strategic importance or not. But I think this war, Zelensky clearly is fighting as though this is the last battle in this war. And I think this is something very, very important to understand. And this is why the outcome of the battle over Bakhmut and then the rest of the Zelensky line, I think is going to be very, very decisive. Because again, as I said before, by now it's too late for Zelensky to order a retreat, because especially beyond that line to the west, there's really no natural defenses that literally, even in this kind of minus 10 degrees Celsius right now, any retreating soldiers won't even be able to dig new trenches because the ground is completely frozen over. So we have to understand that this is really everything, the market doesn't get it. The oil market doesn't get it for sure, but there's no doubt that this thing is going to be very, very, very important, very decisive.
Okay, well, thank you. So we need to pay more attention to what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war at this moment. Um, let's move. So I should just mention we are tracking similar questions throughout 5 major geopolitical conflict zones around the world. We're not going to show you all of them, but we're going to move shortly um, to another very interesting part of the world. Where we are asking very similar questions, China and Taiwan. We're going to be looking at a few different indicators in China today. So again, here we're asking people, over the next few weeks, do you think military tensions between Taiwan and China will be more or less, will be getting more or less intense? David, what do you take away from this with respect to the China-Taiwan conflict? And it's quite different. These data look very, very different, of course, than what we see in Ukraine and Russia.
I think this chart tells me, first of all, without U.S. provocation, there's probably going to be less chance of a conflict.
Yeah,
You can see very clearly on this chart, right? Where the thing spiked was in August when Pelosi basically went to Taiwan, right? So from that point of view, like there is no doubt, and I can tell you, I just came back from Taiwan where I spent the last 2 weeks, and I think a lot of people I talk to, they're following the conflict in Ukraine very closely, and because Taiwanese are waking up to the realization that that to be Ukraine, the next Ukraine is not a good idea. I mean,
yeah,
they are starting to suspect the American motive in pushing the envelope in Ukraine. And they are becoming increasingly, basically wary of becoming a pawn. Okay. America's pawn in its basically war against China, or undeclared war against China. And I think from now, this is the reason why, like, the most senior Taiwanese official in charge of China affairs will be traveling to China next week. Okay. This is also the reason why, by the way, we had an election in December that saw basically the pro-independence, pro-American governing party basically sustaining huge losses. So I think the public in Taiwan is starting to wake up. And I think, this is important. And I think maybe this is the reason why I think, the sense of, I think, the perceived conflict, basically both in Taiwan and China has actually abated, okay, to a great extent. And obviously, it goes out saying that I think that the Taiwanese and the Chinese probably realize, like, right now, the big focus for Xi Jinping is to basically get the economy back, into shape. Having terminated the whole COVID business. So I think this is probably not a time for a China invasion of Taiwan. So I think from that, so there's a sort of a combination of factor. But I think so in sharp contrast, what we're seeing, between Russia and Ukraine, in Taiwan and China, the perception on the ground right now is that things are probably going to de-escalate as opposed to, escalate in the coming weeks, which is somewhat reassuring.
Okay, well, that is reassuring. I was going to say that also it's very interesting just to see that these are kind of, these are parallel lines, whereas we saw very, very different perceptions of Russians and Ukrainians. Here we're seeing pretty much, they're mirroring each other for the most part. But I was actually, I was thinking that we should actually turn to this chart here, David, which actually asks the Taiwanese what their support is for various different options, because it sort of comments on what you had just mentioned. So do you want to share what we're seeing in this chart?
Sure. I think the bottom line is, if you look at this chart, this, by the way, question we only started to ask, for the last, 5 months. So it's not as long a sample as the others, but nevertheless, I think this is very telling because, contrary to what one might think, if you are a casual observer, looking at the Taiwan-China issue from the outside, the reality is that, again, notwithstanding Western propaganda, okay, the fact is, if you look at these numbers here, it shows you that actually about 30% of the Taiwanese are in favor of maintaining, the status quo, which is this kind of, whatever, with China indefinitely. And another 30%, more or less, basically, of the Taiwanese people are in favor of unification, whether right away or eventually. So you're talking about 60% of Taiwanese are only basically, 30% of Taiwanese are in favor of independence, which is definitely a minority. There's no question about that. And this is something that it's not always basically, people don't talk about so much, which I think which is very important. Okay, which is that, again, the Americans, the way that the Western media paints it, it's like, well, Taiwanese want independence, the Chinese won't let them, and they're going to invade them to stop them from declaring independence. The fact is only 30% of Taiwanese, slightly more right now, but, any given week is about 30% Taiwanese are in favor of independence. And relatively, and only half of those are in favor, basically, independence right away. Okay, 10% in fact. So you're talking about a very small minority, and and I think this is the bottom line, and this is something that the world does not always think about, because but this really speaks to the. And by the way, there's going to be an election next year in Taiwan, presidential election, and the way in these statistics are also consistent with polls that suggest that most likely the pro-independence, basically. Party DPP is probably going to lose, probably big time. Okay, and I think that's going to be very important. By the way, I think just we're looking at these numbers. I'm sure Washington is looking at these numbers. People like Anthony Blinken's and then the neocons around him, they're looking at these numbers. They realize that if the U.S. were to lose in Ukraine, okay, this is going to basically this is going to be a big problem for American hegemony. I mean, certainly the Taiwanese are going to probably are going to realize, like, what, we don't want to be next to Ukraine. Ukraine lost anyway, and that let's basically start to build bridges basically with China. I mean, this is also the reason why even in Australia, I mean, just a month ago, like the Australian foreign minister visited China, and then now there's going to be a meeting between the Australian, trade minister with their Chinese counterpart for the first time, I don't know, since when. So I think this is all very important, because this is what is at stake for the U.S. as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. The U.S. got Ukraine into this war with Russia, and then now, if Ukraine loses, I think this is going to harm, I think, U.S. reputation as an arbiter, and I think that is something. Obviously, I have to assume that the U.S. views as something that the U.S. cannot afford, and this is why you then have to ask yourself, like, what is the U.S. willing to do? How far is Washington willing to go in order to stop, basically, to stop Putin from winning the war in Ukraine? And this is, gets into, even bigger issue. Anyway, let's go on.
Okay, let's we're going to go to another, major geopolitical conflict area in a minute. But before I do that, I was just going to mention that if you have any questions for David, please put them in the chat. I'm not able to see what's in the chat right now, but hopefully, put down your questions as we go along, and we'll save some time at the end to answer any questions. We are now going to move to another we're gonna just go here to another area of where there's been some activity recently. David, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, I just, it's actually funny, because my parents live in Taiwan. I was just in Taiwan the last 2 weeks. I just returned home. My home is Israel, okay? And where I'm a very concerned citizen. Let's put it this way. If you look at this chart right here, I think the important thing is that the blue color line, okay? Obviously we all know about the story from about 2 weeks ago, that basically there was an attack on, Iranian military installations, okay, by drones. Now, so far, nobody's taking responsibility. As far as I'm concerned, the drones could have been launched by, just as well that the drones could have been launched by the Americans as by the Israelis. To me, it's not an obvious thing. It's an Israeli drone, only because we know that the Iranians have been supplying, Russia with missiles, with drones, and so on and so forth. So it's possible that the U.S. might decide to take a whack at basically Iranian missile production capabilities, which is what I understand the target, basically was in Iran. So I'm not saying, I don't think it's necessarily Israeli drones, but nevertheless, you can see immediately following the attack, there was a big increase in the perception in both Iran and Israel about, basically increasing military tension. Now, in the case of Iran, it's come off. okay? Because I think the Iranian, it tells you that, the Iranians probably are not going to, I mean, that the Iranians have been, the Iranian government has been playing down, the attack to the extent in fact, they only admitted one such attack. My understanding, there were multiple attacks, but they only admitted one such attack, and then they haven't really been sustaining their rhetoric. That's why the Iranians has come down. What's interesting to me is the fact in Israel, you can see there has been basically an increase in perception of military tension going forward, at least now back at zero. And I think even at zero is very important because we now have a new government in Israel, as you all know.
I'm going to move to the next slide for that, so you can see what's happening in terms of the new government. Yeah,
exactly.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So you can see here, there has been, since January at least, there's been an increase in the approval of the Israeli government by the Israelis when it comes to the handling of the conflict with Iran. And I think that just speaks to the fact that I think Bibi Netanyahu enjoys tremendous credibility here in Israel when it comes to dealing with Iran. Okay. And Bibi recently said that, that on 3 separate occasions, he did consider attacking Iran in order to preempt, really destroy Iran's basically nuclear weapons. Okay. Now that basically, Bibi's back in power, now that the US has come off its high horse when it comes to wanting to get a nuclear deal with Iran. Okay. I would argue that, the chance that Israel might decide to launch an attack on Iran definitely has gone up. Okay. But in any event, and you can see that, in the numbers, it's not that clear cut. By the way, it's not like, in this case, I don't think if Bibi were to order an attack, it's not like, the Israeli public is going to see it coming. Okay. Because, by definition, such an attack is going to be, it's going to be dangerous. It's going to be risky. It's not something I think Bibi will do just like that on the fly. But I think it does make some sense to the extent that, Bibi has said that he wants to basically establish diplomatic ties with Russia, with Saudi Arabia. And given that, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries have sort of given up on the US as providing essentially, security umbrella, I think Israel needs to be seen as getting tough on Iran. Especially given the domestic situation here in Israel, which you probably all heard about. Okay. So I think from that point of view, this doesn't tell me, our data doesn't tell me that Israel is about to, launch an imminent attack on Iran. But what it does tell me is that the probability of an attack probably has gone up. Okay. And that's, I think, it's important because the Israeli public is well aware that Iran has now reached such a point that they have enough material to make 4 or 5 bombs right now. And given Iranians have perfected the drones, you could literally now have Iranians, basically drones carrying nuclear attack directly on Israel. And I think this threat is taken very seriously, myself included. And I think from that point of view, the Israelis might decide, the leadership might decide that they don't have too much time to wait, to sit on their hands while Iran basically takes its nuclear game to the next level.
Well, that's very sobering, David. I think I'm going to turn us to another set of data now that I'm hoping we'll be able to pull out some better news from, perhaps. So this is what we've just gone through is a couple of charts from our military conflict risk index. We're now going to turn to what David, you cleverly called our Cold War II index. And we're going to look at this index has a bunch of both kind of politically oriented questions as well as some more macroeconomic type questions in it as well. And we'll look to see what we're seeing there and to see how this kind of rounds out the picture that David, you're seeing emerging. Why don't we start with this first question where we're asking people in Russia, the US, and China how they see each other. So this is the perspective of everyday people on the street, not the elites. How do they actually see each other on a daily basis? David, what do you make of this chart?
I think this chart is very fascinating because this chart actually, in black is what the Russians think. How many Russians consider the US to be an enemy or an adversary? And in blue is obviously how many Americans who think Russia is an enemy or an adversary. To me, the most interesting thing is the blue color line, where we've seen actually this number having come off over the last 2 months. I mean, this number had peaked around 60%, in December, and now it's about 50%. So we've gone from a situation where 60% of Americans view Russia as an enemy or an adversary to now just basically half of the country. I suspect this is also about the American people waking up to realize what this whole issue is about. I think, and we haven't done any party affiliation in terms of which Americans feel this way, but I think many Americans clearly are very upset that the Americans are almost writing a blank check for Ukraine to basically fight this war against Russia for reasons that for many Americans is not clear, that it doesn't obviously serve American interest. And I think from that point of view, you have to understand $100 billion for the last 12 months. That's more than half of what basically, that's more than double of what Russia spends on its own defense budget annually before the war. And I think from that point of view, I think this chart, again, it always tells me is that Americans are having second thoughts about why America, American aid, American money, American weapons are going to Ukraine to keep this war going. I think, again, this number, it would be very interesting to see what happens to this number if it continues to fall. Obviously, this will become a major issue, I think, for the Republican Party. I mean, obviously, the Republicans have not really, they talked about, wanting to basically cut back on defense spending, but they haven't targeted Ukraine spending yet. But if this number continues to fall, I think, this will change the political calculus for Washington in terms of, the sustainability of the investment the U.S. is making to keep this war going.
David, we're also gathering data on support for the war amongst the G7 countries. In our data set, the Americans are consistently least supportive of financial support for Ukraine amongst the G7, and we'll have a new data set coming out shortly on that. So that would be consistent with what you're talking about here as well. Okay, so let's move on to this chart. The China-U.S. relationship, we've just had this spy balloon situation. How do you interpret these data in light of that?
I think it's fascinating because, you would have thought, given the amount of propaganda, American propaganda about China being a threat, I mean, this administration, the Biden administration, has gone like an all-out war against China. I mean, things have gotten so much worse since the end of the Trump administration. There's no question that U.S.-China relationships dramatically deteriorated, and with Americans trying to paint China as a threat, as a security, national security threat in every possible way. And yet, only 50% of Americans see China as an enemy or an adversary. And that's been very stable. And I think that speaks volume that, the American people apparently don't necessarily share the same view about China. And I think that is interesting. What is also interesting is the fact that, less than 40% of Chinese people see U.S. as an enemy and adversary. I mean, this is despite the fact, almost every week, the U.S. is issuing more sanctions, more embargo, more this and this and that. So I think it just tells me that the American people and the Chinese people, so far, they rightly or wrongly, I personally think is more rightly, they're not viewing each other, they're not viewing, there's no evidence that there's increased hostility of the Chinese people towards U.S. and American people towards China. And this is a very, very big difference. So from that point of view, there's a real dichotomy here between what the elites, the leadership feels, especially the neocons and the Biden administration people, versus what everyday Americans and Chinese people think about the two countries' relationship.
I mean, even in the U.S. right now, you can see that there's absolutely no change in the data despite this very high-profile, balloon incident. There's no change in our data. This is data as of yesterday, as of the end of day yesterday, and there's still nothing changing, even though it's on the front page headlines every day. So that's I think interesting to kind of challenge our perceptions about what's actually happening, or what Americans and Chinese people on the ground actually think. Okay, let's do we want to look at this one, David?
Yeah, I think this is obviously very interesting because it just, it asks how many Chinese feel that Russia is an ally versus how many Russians feel China is an ally. I think, they're pretty much the same right now. It's about 30%. It's not 50%, by the way, and that's interesting, right? I mean, you might have thought that the number should be a lot higher, but it's about 30%. I mean, there's no doubt. I think, I mean, what the Biden administration is trying to do every day is to basically push the two biggest enemies, the U.S., China, and Russia, in bed together. I mean, but I think, it's still around 30. Again, this is where the dichotomy, maybe the leadership, maybe Putin and Xi Jinping would feel very differently about this question. But again, it just tells you that the people in these countries are reasonable, are much more reasonable, and they're peace-loving people, and they're much more trustful. And this is where, I think it's very, very interesting. Yeah.
Okay. This is an interesting question as well. So we're asking, in all three countries, China, Russia, and the United States, in the midst of a global power struggle, which group currently has the upper hand? And so we're asking them, is it US, Europe, and their allies versus China, Russia, and their allies? I don't know if you want to start by commenting on perhaps Russia, what we're seeing in the data there.
Yeah, I think the most interesting, I mean, I think the U.S. obviously is high. That's no surprise. U.S. is still, I mean, it's got the largest army in the world. Like, it spends more money on defense every year than the 10 next biggest, basically, defense spenders. U.S. is still the largest economy in the world. So the fact that U.S. feels like they've got the upper hand, that's no surprise to me. But what is surprising, of course, is the fact that basically 70% of Russians feel like their side, meaning their side with China, have the upper hand. And I think that is important because what it's telling me is after a year of the most incredibly dire sanctions that the US has imposed on Russia, that if 70% of Russians still think that they got the upper hand, it just tells you that the sanctions haven't been too successful until now. That, despite the setback, perhaps in the battlefield, the Russians are still very confident. And also it tells me that the Russians, and then we've seen this again and again in the wars that the Russians fought. Just think about the Napoleonic War. Just think about the Second World War. The Russians basically, they were on the losing side in the first 18 months of these two major wars. And then they snapped and came storming back. The Russians don't judge, success or failure based on what happens in the first inning of the war. And I think it just tells you that the Russians still have a lot of confidence. And I think, it tells me that if they still believe that they got the upper hand, that means Putin still has strong support from his people to continue. And I think this is, the question is, so I think this is something very, very important, is to understand the Russians a year into this thing, regardless what you might say about what's happened to the Russian economy, what the Russian performs in the battlefield, I have to believe that the biggest takeaway here is that do not underestimate the staying power of the Russian people in this conflict versus the US. That is probably the biggest risk that Washington is taking right now, in my view, is that I'm not sure the US is going to have so much staying power.
Wow. Okay. Again, very sobering. So let's now move, I guess, I think, to a little more. We have a couple of more economically oriented indicators that we're going to take a look at. Let me just pull this up. Okay, so here we are with what we've called our discretionary spending score. Basically, we're just asking a question about, people's discretionary spending. So which best describes your overall spending this month compared to the previous month on things like eating out, furniture, electronics, and clothing? And this shows you the share of respondents who said their spending increased minus the share who said their spending this month has decreased. David, we've seen this, China about face on its zero COVID policy. We've been collecting these data since January of last year, and we can now compare sort of what happened last year versus this year. What does this tell us about the expected China reopening boost?
I think, I think obviously, as you said, we only have 1 year worth of data here. And then we know that consumer spending is highly seasonal, right? I mean, just like the Americans tend to spend a lot, basically just before Christmas.
Yeah.
And spending typically slows after basically January. The same thing with China, right? Basically. So from that point of view, the fact that actually we haven't seen a slowdown in January relative to December. In fact, January is stronger than December. If you look at the Chinese data here, I would say on a seasonal adjusted basis, this will suggest that the Chinese recovery is real. Of course, listen, it is also very important. It doesn't tell me it's going off the chart strong. I mean, if you look at the massive rally in Asian assets, over the last basically 4 weeks, I mean, I think the market might be running the risk of getting ahead of itself in terms of expecting basically like a massive takeoff. I think all we can say by looking at our data is that things are definitely improving. But I think, I would be very, very basically, I would be very reluctant. I mean, I think, not just reluctant. I know by looking at these numbers that spending probably just improving, but it's not like, it's all of a sudden taking off in a very big way. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I'll just also pull up this financial optimism score, which we're also collecting for the same time period, where we're looking at, which of these best describes your view about your financial situation. Are you very optimistic, to very pessimistic? And, we can see that the Chinese have clearly experienced an increase in optimism.
Yeah, I think this is much more telling, right? I mean, this tells me that sure, like obviously, in December, there was a massive, basically like decline, right? Basically just immediately after the relaxation of the COVID restrictions. And then we've seen a bit of a basically increase in the last couple of weeks. But if you look but this only takes us back to where we were, like in the third quarter last year, right? I mean, like to September level, we're still below what we were like in August, for example. So I think from that point of view, again, it just tells me that the recovery in China is real, but I think it's not as strong as you might think it is. Okay, I think a lot is still riding on because there's still a lot of issues, right? For example, the housing market, there's an issue. Obviously, the Chinese people are also very, very aware of the tech war that the U.S. is launching, right? Just basically like last week, there are reports that the U.S. is about to apply a complete embargo on Huawei. Remember, like, Huawei was like, well, until now, it was like, but you have to understand, the Huawei is like, for the Chinese, is like, they spent 30 years creating one Huawei, right? Basically, first of all, the U.S., decided to basically sanction its export of 5G equipment. Now, the latest news is the U.S. is going to stop supplying anything to Huawei. I mean, even the low-end chips, they're going to cut it off. So from that point of view, I think the Chinese citizen obviously is like, well, they don't understand what the hell is going on here. All they see is that, that things are not going well, And I think from that point of view, this is why like COVID is one thing. There's a broader picture there, which has to do with geopolitical tension, has to do with the fact that the housing market is still basically very weak in China. So all these things, they're still looking for. So I would say that the worst is over, but, like maybe, I mean, things are probably going to look up from here, but we should not expect this kind of like off the chart, like rip, of the Chinese economy. And I think that's very, very important. I also think that, we also have to wait to see what happens basically in March, because in March we have the Chinese, National Congress. It's in March when the Congress meets that the new state council in China is going to take over, meaning that the new policymakers are going to be officially taking up their jobs. I would expect to see a lot more stimulus policies, I think, coming along in March.
Okay, now I promised everybody we would spend a minute on the labor market, so we're going to turn to one more chart, which shows what we called our job availability score, and then we'll turn to questions right after this chart. So we'll wrap it up. So we've asked kind of a novel question here about the labor market. What is your view of your current employment situation? Jobs are plentiful, jobs are not so plentiful, and jobs are hard to get. And this chart is the share of people who believe jobs are plentiful minus the share who believe jobs are hard to get. So, I know a lot of difficulty reading the tea leaves or conflicting views about what's happening in the US labor market. How do you read this?
Yeah, I think, by the way, I love this basically, this chart, because I think it really, it gives me a lot of confidence that, that the data we're collecting reflect the underlying reality, right? I mean, because you can see, like, US is higher than China, and China is higher than basically Russia, which kind of makes sense to me, okay? But all three is above zero, meaning that, people think that there are more jobs than there are fewer jobs. And that also basically confirms my prior thinking about these three economies. Now, of course, the fact that the US is very stable, that is very, very telling, right? Because the US job, yeah, I mean, US has been creating like 250,000 jobs almost every month on average, right? Obviously, last month was an off the chart number, but on average, the US is still basically creating jobs at a very, very steady pace. And then, you look at the weekly jobs or claims, it's still near all-time low. So I think the fact that, the blue line is so stable tells me that anybody who thinks the US labor market is set to deteriorate, that the US is about to go into a recession and the Fed is going to pivot, I think they're just dreaming. And I think the market just continues to get it wrong there. In the case of China, it's also interesting is recover, right? Because, I mean, that is not that surprising, because you think about this, like with the lockdowns being lifted, like, people realize like, well, restaurants, stores can now start to hire people. So I think that is also indicative. And it doesn't mean that, jobs are being created overnight, but we're asking a question about job availability. That's important. And the fact that Russia is still above zero, I think that, again, tells you that, anybody who says the Russian economy is about to fall off the cliff, they have absolutely no idea what's going on here. They're just basically buying into propaganda. Even the IMF last week just revised up sharply their GDP growth forecast for Russia this year from -3% to now probably around zero, something to that effect. So again, I think, the economic situation seems to be quite stable in all three countries. I think that's the important thing.
Well, that's really very interesting a set of indicators, and I don't know if everybody it necessarily agrees with your interpretation of them, but we'll hear. Please send us your comments and questions. The first question that actually just relates to the last, I think relates to the last chart, is really around the question of sanctions, and can we connect. So this is a question that's come in from one of our participants asking, can we connect the data that we're collecting with the impact of the sanctions? And what do you think, David?
I think, listen, again, if I look at the numbers, again, we're looking at a lot of numbers, right? We're looking at basically, optimism, spending, all that, and Putin's approval ratings, so on and so forth. I would say that if there's any effect, it's actually fairly limited. And by the way, this is generally consistent with the fact, if you look at, for example, Russian seaborne oil exports, actually year to date, it's been recovering.
Yeah.
By the way, this is something I made a video about this actually a few weeks ago. You can actually look up my YouTube channel if you're interested. And the reason is because the reason why the sanctions have not hurt Russia that much, especially the energy sanction, is this. Okay. It's actually very interesting, because I thought, in December, like after, the latest, oil sanctions, from Europe kicked in, like in December, and then we just saw another round basically just this week. I thought, like, we were now, like, Russia is going to be in trouble, like we're going to see a big drop in Russian oil export. But guess what? If you look at the weekly data we have for Russian seaborne oil export, it's actually been surging. Okay. And the reason for this is very simple. Today, 34%, okay, of Russian oil is being transported by what's so-called dark tankers. I mean, that's what my video was about. It's called basically dark tankers saving the world economy. In fact, that's what it is. Because I would argue if it weren't for these dark tankers, guess what? Oil prices would be a lot higher. The world economy is probably already in the recession. So what are dark tankers? Dark tankers are tankers that are sort of like, they are not complying with the existing sanctions. And by the way, it's not that surprising because like right now, like, you can make so much money. Right now, it's like, right now, like, given the price, basically transporting Russian oil the price has gone up, the freight rate's gone up so much that right now, like you just have to do like 5 trips between Russia and China. You'll be able to basically buy yourself a brand new tanker. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, like there's no doubt that basically the economics of dark tankers is very attractive for a lot of ship owners who are willing to take that risk. Now, that is not that surprising. Much more surprising is the fact, let me tell you this, the Americans have so far not boarded a single one of these dark tanker ships. I can tell you, like, if I have this data, I mean, I'm an investor in an Israeli company that actually tracks these dark tankers day to day. And by the way, their biggest client is probably the CIA. But I can tell you that the CIA knows which tanker is not complying with the sanctions. And yes, so far, the US has not boarded one such ship so far. So far, Europeans government have not persecuted, pressed criminal charges on one such basically ship owners. In other words, that so far, notwithstanding the talk about sanctions, Americans and Europeans have not been enforcing these sanctions.
Right.
And this is why the sanctions have not been hurting the Russians.
So I think that, we're basically capturing, our indicators are kind of indirectly one measure, when you look at our discretionary spending score and our labor market stuff and our financial optimism and so on, indirectly we're able to kind of capture the impact on the Russian people. But obviously, the other indicators you're talking about, David, when you look at the trade data, they're more direct indicators. Like we know that there's a lot of transshipment of Western products through, through other countries, through post-Soviet countries, for example, and so on. A lot more trade from China. So there's a lot of other. I would say that we're capturing them maybe in an indirect way. I know that there's a few other questions. I don't think we're gonna have time to answer them. What people want to know about your outlook on inflation and a few other things which we didn't touch upon in this webinar, but I'm afraid we're out of time. But I wanted to thank you so much, David, for taking the time to explain kind of your perspective on these really what I think are a novel series of indicators. I think you've challenged us in terms of, how do we, kind of think about conventional wisdom here, and what are the areas we need to pay more attention to that we and the world is not paying, and the markets perhaps are not paying enough attention to. And if there were any questions that you did not get answered, please feel free to reach out to David or myself. And if you have any more questions about, the other, we didn't show you everything. We kind of highlighted what we thought was most interesting, but we'd be happy to share more. So thank you so much, David, and to our attendees, and join us at our next RIWI webinar. Thanks.
I think, by the way, more importantly, anybody who wants to be able to gain access to this data, they should get in touch with us. And it's on a subscription basis only. Obviously, there's going to be a cost, but literally what we're offering is basically these data, literally that you can access on your phone in an app that you can click on and get it. So if you're interested,
I will tell you that probably David and I wake up every morning and check the data. It's a little bit addictive. So be in touch if you're one of those data people who like to do the same thing. Thank you. Thanks, David.
No, you're welcome.